This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Kimbell Art Museum Deputy Director George Shackelford about the museum's current exhibit, Turner's Modern World. The exhibition explores J.M.W. Turner's lifelong interest in the inventions, events, politics, society, culture, and science of his time, which resulted in many of his most original works and transformed his way of painting. The exhibit is on view at the Kimbell through February 6th. At the end of the episode, I'll be taking a look at some of the week's top art headlines. But first up, a dive into Turner's Modern World with George Shackelford. Shackelford, thank you so much for being willing to be on the podcast today to talk about this current exhibit of J.M.W. Turner at the Kimbell Art Museum. Maybe you could start with kind of giving us some background on how the exhibit came about and what the history of this exhibit is.
Well, thank you first, Greg, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Turner's Modern World is an exhibition that was organized by Tate Britain in London, in cooperation with the Kimbell Art Museum here and with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, where the exhibition will be shown in the spring and into the summer of 2022. It's a show that was really quite a natural for Tate to partner with Boston on, because Boston owns one of Turner's most important modern pictures, and I use modern with an underline and inverted commas around it. It is the Great Slave Ship from the Royal Academy of 1840, which unfortunately neither traveled to London nor is it in Fort Worth, but will be seen with the exhibition only in Boston. When Tate Britain approached us about the exhibition, I leapt on it because I thought this is a great topic, and Turner is such a fantastic artist. I mean, in my mind, the greatest British painter, period, and having an opportunity to show more than 100 works by him, oil paintings, watercolors, drawings, one print, some sketchbooks, the full range of Turner's lifelong career from the 1790s to the 1840s. It was just too good an opportunity to pass up, even though the Kimbell's Lone Turner could not be less modern. It is a subject taken from Ovid. So nonetheless, we were delighted to be invited to participate. Turner's Modern World the exhibition really concentrates on the idea of Turner's engagement with the world around him, not only with the facts of the world, like the rise in industrialization in Britain, the sort of changing means of transport and the rise of cities versus the country, etc., but also with the issues of war and peace. Turner living through a period of an enormous military conflict with the Napoleonic Wars, and then also, to some extent, with Turner's involvement in politics and causes, which are touched on in the exhibition. And then finally, the modern painter, the notion that Turner's way of painting, a complete invention of his own, a complete transformation of his early style into this late style for which he is now most famous, that was in a way a modern act, an act of contemporary assertion of a new artistic way of being. So that's the sort of premise of the exhibition, grosso modo, across the whole 120 odd objects in the show.
I feel like an exhibit like this really benefits by learning a lot about context. For the folks that maybe didn't get a PhD in art history, could you just kind of set the stage for perhaps a term like the hierarchy of painting and how that's something that he deals with over the course of this in terms of what subject matter he chooses to explore?
Well, in the Royal Academy, when Turner was a student there, the most important thing to do for a painter was to learn how to paint the figure, the human figure. And this was preparatory not towards portraiture, which was fairly low ranking, but towards the painting of history. And by that, I don't mean what happened last week, but in fact, what happened centuries ago. So the Greek and Roman history, or in Britain, sometimes ancient British history, would be the subject matter that would be expected of the Royal Academy successful artist. Turner was pretty lousy at it to begin with. That was not his forte. He was not, a great gifted draftsman of the human figure. And it wasn't what he was interested in either. He was interested in something much more, much more expressive to him, and that took the form of landscape. And landscape was, of course, already a British tradition. And in the 18th century, a lot of artists had turned to painting landscape because it was profitable. People liked to buy landscape paintings for their houses, and this is always a consideration of what an artist might turn to. He has to make a living, after all, and the British have always been nationally extremely interested in landscape and in the British landscape and in the conservation of landscape nowadays, and in the 19th century with the spoliation of landscape. But in Turner's day, landscape painting was not particularly revered as a discipline. It fit. It wasn't as low as still life, which was the bottom of the ladder, but it certainly wasn't as high up as history painting or any kind of religious subject matter, and even not as high up as portraiture would have been. But Turner really changed that. Turner was one of the artists, along with the slightly younger John Constable, who asserted that landscape painting was vitally important in terms of art history, and picking up on the lessons of the past, and particularly the great example for them was the Franco-Roman painter Claude Lorrain, who was active in Rome in the 17th century. And Claude was adored by British collectors, and therefore by the Academy, and then by the nascent National Gallery. And he was one of their archetypes, if you will, one of the artists that they strove to emulate. And Turner certainly goes through this Claudian period in his work. And for instance, we have in the exhibition a wonderful picture of Richmond Hill on the Prince Regent's birthday with the foretitle England, as if England were always a great landscape party. And it's completely based on a Claudian, prototype. Lots of golden light coming through the trees framing the composition on both sides, and a beautiful distant view of the landscape sort of receding properly into space and getting less and less defined as you go into the canvas. Figures in the foreground doing something to catch your interest there. And this is the kind of painting that by the end of his career, Turner was just completely had bypassed. Totally not interested in defining the figures in the foreground. I mean, they're pictures that we know are meant to represent something, and yet you can barely discern the subject in the painting at all. And so he revolutionizes landscape. Not only does he insist that it's important, he insists that he's going to change the way you perceive it, and that the public is going to learn about what painting should be through the example of his landscape painting. So I think that he rebels in a way against the academic rules and breaks them all, and succeeds brilliantly by virtue of doing so.
When I look at his prolific body of work, I try to imagine how his work would have been received. And I know that there are the shows at the Academy, but then he also had his own gallery space in his studio. The more difficult subject matter, would he necessarily submit that to show? Or is the difficult subject matter, whether it's a disaster at sea or the slave ship or work regarding Waterloo, was that for public consumption, or was it, the difficult nature more left to him sharing it in more intimate space?
Oh, it was absolutely for public consumption. The paintings that you mentioned, particularly Waterloo or the slave ship, were paintings that he definitely showed to the public, and in both cases actually with not a particularly great reception, because people didn't like the pessimistic, rather mournful tone of his Waterloo painting. It was, after all, the greatest battle that they had ever fought, and his painting was sad rather than joyful. The slave ship was a chaotic image visually and very challenging in terms of the subject matter of these enslaved Africans who were being thrown overboard so that they could be claimed for insurance rather than arrive dead or dying at their destination. Those kinds of subjects did not appeal to a Royal Academy audience, but Turner was insistent that those paintings would be shown to the public. The reaction to them, particularly by the 1840s, when he is at his full tilt, if you will, the reaction was often grounded in the appearance of the pictures, and people found them mystifying. Found the what they saw as chaotic brushwork, a kind of incoherent construction to the canvas, and which of course Turner was completely in control of. Absolutely, there's no chaos there. It's completely organized if it's chaos, and they saw them. They were baffled by what they looked like. They had not seen paintings that looked like that before. They were expecting, when it was a seascape, they expected for there to be a recognizable boat where you could see the outlines very clearly of the boat, and the horizon would be clear and you could see what was happening. And when Turner presents them with a kind of a whirlpool of snowstorm in one of his most daring paintings in the exhibition, they don't get it. They don't understand what's happening. And Constable had it right when he said that the public looks at Turner's paintings and they think he's making fun of them. And so in a reaction, they laugh at him, self-defensively. And of course, Turner's deadly serious, and he's not laughing at the public. He's just saying, I can't deal with you on any terms but my own, but my most honest terms for myself. And this is how I have to show my art to you, and come along with me. Let me lead you in a way towards a new way of looking, really. And the public just, in large part, the public was unwilling or unable to join him on that trip right away. Now, of course, he's one of the most popular artists in Britain. His painting, The Fighting Temeraire, is voted the most popular painting in Britain regularly, and now it's on the back of a banknote. And so he's beloved now, but certainly in his own day in the 1840s. The cognoscenti got it, the collectors got it, but the public often didn't get it, and the critics made fun of him for, painting with mashed potatoes and gravy, when in fact he was just trying to convey something of the power and the majesty of nature.
Beyond what he was able to express through the form, a great deal of what we see in this exhibit is over his life's work, how he is reflecting the world around him in a time of great change, right?
That's certainly true.
We're seeing the Industrial Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. Does Turner have an agenda here, or is he just reflecting the world around him?
Well, I think that changes over the course of his career. When he sets out to record the low-level factories, foundries, etc., that he visits, typically at nighttime, so that the fire is glowing and seen as a kind of I don't want to say too satanic presence, but Blake has it right when he talks about the dark satanic mills that are despoiling the British landscape. Turner engages he chooses those subjects and depicts them because they are also they're picturesque. And even if he's doing it in a little sketchbook, he's admiring what he can achieve, even for personal consumption, with the painting of a forge or a cannon factory or an anchor factory at night. But so those, I think, are him actually being interested in the subject, being willing to treat it, and then as the years go by, those are in the 1790s, let's say. As the years go by the 1840s, when he's showing you the tiny spark of red that you are meant to read as the furnace on a steamboat, he's still interested in coal fire, and what it can do. But he's more subtle about it in a way, and what he's less preoccupied with showing you the fire itself than he is with the power that it unleashes. So the steam power, that's one of the great inventions of the 19th century, is the steam engine. Well, it's invented in the 18th century, but put to use in the 19th century with the invention of the steamboat and the railroad train, the steam-powered railroad train. Those developments in Britain just changed the world. I mean, they changed society completely. They changed time. You can get places faster than you ever could before, and distances are conquered suddenly. And so Turner celebrates those things while, sometimes perhaps commenting on, are we sure that all of this smoke and steam are the best thing for our world? I think, honestly, Craig, we're probably reading a little too much into it for our own point of view about climate change when we look at his Waterloo, Thames above Waterloo as an image of pollution. I think he probably loved the visual effect of the smoke and the steam and the nastiness that was all around that part of the Thames, because it provided such a good subject for painting. But he is engaged with it, not just as a reflection of what's happening. It's not simply that it's there. It's that he chooses to treat these subjects and to give them a certain amount of importance and glory.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about Turner in context to other artists of his time. In his earlier work, I can see that he is bouncing around in the same world as like Joseph Wright of Derby. And of course, Constable is always there. But his later work, I think we have to think of folks like Jericho and Goya. Maybe you could help place us in the world of his contemporaries.
Certainly. Well, yeah, I mean, he comes out of a British landscape tradition that is exemplified on the one hand by Joseph Wright of Derby, who treats the more romantic side of subject matter. I mean, Wright of Derby loves a moonlight scene or a volcano. He's good at those things. There's also the completely pastoral side of things that were really glorified a lot in watercolor by artists like Paul Sandby, who's was famous in his day but hardly known nowadays at all. Turner is the contemporary of Géricault and Goya. He certainly, almost certainly saw Géricault's Raft of the Medusa when it was exhibited in London in the 1820s. And so he's aware of those or cross-channel developments. He expresses some of the same, I don't know whether you call it a kind of zeitgeist of these romantic artists of the 20s and 30s, though he's coming to it typically after the death of, his peak is after the death of both Goya and Géricault, who are a bit older than he is. And then he comes up against a new generation of artists who, ironically, are the darlings of the guy who is his biggest apologist, John Ruskin, who thinks that Turner is the greatest painter of all time, and yet who also very much admires this kind of almost nitpicking realism of artists like John Everett Millais or William Holman Hunt, the pre-Raphaelites, who have have the same fan base in Ruskin as Turner, but could hardly be more different from him. And he, in my view, wipes them off the map. I mean, they're nothing by comparison in terms of genius or indeed in terms of influence. Because one of the things, Craig, to remember is that Turner, while he is well known and very much appreciated during his lifetime, after he dies, what Turner is becomes a completely different thing, because he bequeaths his entire artistic production, everything that he has in his possession when he dies, he gives to the nation. And the nation accepts the responsibility of exhibiting these works, it takes them a long while, but of giving them, proper space. Really only in the 20th century do they get a wing of Tate Britain, the Clore Gallery, which they now have and occupy. The Turner bequest occupies that whole wing of the building. But works by Turner, including the sketchiest, his watercolors are shown in abundance, and modern artists who come to London in the 1870s, all the French artists who were there in exile from the Franco-Prussian War, like Monet and Pissarro, they see Turner's work in the 1870s. They see works by Turner exhibited in Paris as well. Whistler moves from London to Paris and back to London, and is profoundly influenced by what he sees in the Turner bequest. And so Turner has this unbeknownst to him, impact on what happens after him, and that really is important, and it really matters. So it's kind of, there's this post-mortem Turner that is a completely different man in a way than, or an exaggerated version of the man that we already knew about, or that his contemporaries already knew about. And after he's gone, he has a meaning that is extraordinary. Rothko is incredibly impressed by Turner when he sees Turner at the Museum of Modern Art. Even the slave ship is a picture that he sees at MoMA. And it's revelatory to him, and it changes the way he perceives color even. And because of his admiration for Turner, he gives a bunch of paintings to Tate, and so there's this wonderful gift of great Rothkos, late Rothkos, that are there because of Turner, really. So there's so many ways in which he touches other artists, accidentally, causally, and it's such a rich subject. I mean, we could go on for days and days about this idea, and books and articles have all been published on this, and lots of lectures given. But I think that Also, among artists that I know, among painters that I know, this is an exhibition at the Kimbell that they are dead to come to see because of how much take inspiration from this long dead artist. I mean, he's been gone now, for 170 years, and he's still an extraordinary figure for us.
The way we judge according to modern aesthetic, people adore and love Turner. And obviously he was quite successful in his time. And, he winds up influencing, like you said, Rothko, but even closer, Whistler, the Impressionists. I guess, something I've always been curious about is if Turner was lauded in his own time, so often we see copycat artistry. Why is it that we really don't see the aesthetic that he kind of pioneered take off for another 30, 40 years or even more after his death?
Well, I think it's actually there. It's just a bit subliminal, maybe. Take for example, the artists who are British born, who come to America and who have a great career in America. And I've named two. The earlier one is Thomas Cole, who certainly, is aware of what's going on in England. He has a transatlantic career in a way. And while Cole's paintings don't actually end up looking a lot like Turner, it's not like he's copying Turner. The notion that you can use landscape for that kind of highly emotional message, that I think is connects Cole to Turner, even though you wouldn't necessarily look at them and say, "Oh boy, Cole loves Turner." An artist that you would say that about is Thomas Moran, who is nowadays perhaps best known for his, gigantic views of the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or Yosemite, and who takes Turner's color sense, particularly the high-keyed, high chroma color, and applies it to the American West. English-born, immigrates to the United States and becomes famous for his paintings of the American landscape. And then in between, you have an artist like Frederick Church, whose Twilight in the Wilderness, this ghastly sunset that he paints at the outset of the Civil War, a kind of statement of conflict and to come, really, blood to come, if you will. He's an artist who is very much aware of Turner and has seen paintings by him. And while he doesn't emulate Turner's breadth of brushstroke, for instance, he is very keenly interested in Turner's color sense, I think.
I like to think that I have a bit of a broader audience than just the regional. I would love to talk a little bit about the Kimbell as an institution. I don't know if everyone nationwide or worldwide appreciates the jewel box that the Kimbell is and how it doesn't have an encyclopedic focus. It has something far more refined, which makes it an amazing institution to visit.
Well, you've asked the right question and you've come to the right place. There's nothing I like better than to brag about the Kimbell Art Museum. We're about to enter our 50th year. The Kimbell was opened in October of 1972. It is the brainchild of a couple, Kay and Velma Kimbell, and their Mr. Kimbell's sister and brother-in-law created the Kimbell Art Foundation in the 1930s. And Mr. and Mrs. Kimbell, through their acquisitions of mostly paintings, mostly English and French, mostly 18th and early 19th century, they had amassed a great number of works of art by the time Mr. Kimbell died in the mid-1960s. He bequeathed the foundation already owned the works of art, He bequeathed the foundation the vast bulk of his estate. Mrs. Kimbell signed over her life use of that even from the very beginning. And the trustees, the directors of the Kimbell board set about fulfilling Mr. Kimbell's desire to create a museum, in his words, quote, of the first class, close. Their ambition was really refined by their first director, a man named Rick Brown, who came from California, who was the person who I think helped the board define the terms of the Kimbell, which would be not to create a museum that collected everything or collected everything in depth, but instead a museum that collected carefully and with great excellence, with an insistence on the work being the very best of its kind that they could possibly get their hands on. And from the beginning, Brown and the board of directors with him decided to strike out in a broader direction than Mr. Kimbell, so that one of the first works that Rick Brown bought was a fantastic Bodhisattva Maitreya, an ancient Southeast Asian bronze, and the collection then expanded to works from most Asian centers, most ancient American centers, and Africa. We only own 8 examples of African art, but they're all typically very, very fine. And then European painting and sculpture. And the collection really only now numbers about 350 objects. And so it has not really grown very much, though it's morphed. Things have been let go. The things that Mr. and Mrs. Kimbell had more for decorative purposes have gone away and been replaced by things that are of greater importance, we think. And the collection continues to change and to grow. We've bought a Bonnard recently, or a great Poussin, which we bought about 10 years ago, a fantastic scene from one of Poussin's first set of the 7 Sacraments. So we try to buy at a kind of level of quality that means that we don't buy very much. It happens seldom, and we hope spectacularly. The collection is displayed. Its original building, which opened 50 years ago next year, was designed by the amazing architect Louis Kahn, who is known in California above all for the Salk Institute in La Jolla. He's known on the East Coast for his academic buildings at the University of Pennsylvania or Bryn Mawr, but also for the first extension to the Yale Art Gallery in the 1950s, and then for his Yale Center for British Art, which actually opened after the Kimbell did, and opened after Kahn's death. It followed the Kimbell by about 5 years. He's known also internationally he's revered by architects internationally. He's one of the gods who built so few buildings that he's best known by specialists rather than by the broader public. He's not like Philip Johnson, for instance, where there's a building by him in almost every great American city. He's an architect who built, capital cities in Bangladesh, or the Indian Institute of Management, or these remarkable buildings, or a synagogue someplace, or he was a phenomenal architect that still nowadays we see groups of architects coming to the Kimbell really in a kind of pilgrimage. 8 years ago, we expanded the museum and added a building designed by an architect who very much admired Louis Kahn, who worked for Louis Kahn briefly in his youth, that is Renzo Piano, who has probably built more museum buildings in the last 20 years than any other architect, but seemed like exactly the right fit for building a building in complement to Kahn's original that would have its own character and its own strength, but also be a good partner, a good friend to the original building. And that the opening of that building has allowed us to exhibit much greater quantities of the permanent collection at any one time, because we don't have to take anything down to do a special exhibition. So Turner's Modern World is in the galleries that we have for special exhibitions in the piano pavilion, and the permanent collection is in its full glory here in the Kahn building. We're a museum that people who have not been before walk in and they're dazzled by the light. I mean, it's not that it's dazzling bright; it's just dazzling smart. And the way Kahn manipulates light by reflecting it, by having it sort of spill over strange surfaces like rather shiny but somewhat rough concrete, for instance. That's the ceiling surface in the majority of the galleries, by giving you these very small hints, these kind of eyebrow-shaped windows over the arches at each end of these barrel vaults, by giving you a clerestory window that reminds you that his vault is not in fact sitting on the wall, but in fact resting on two posts that are 100 feet apart. I mean, he's an incredibly subtle and clever architect, and Piano follows in that same idea by taking his measurements from Kahn's building, and rather than having light expand, Piano seeks to filter the light, to have it go from its maximal down to a more filtered and nuanced form. Kahn gives you a slit of light that he then gets to expand as it moves down into the galleries and flows over the artwork below. So it's a fully aesthetic experience all the way around. I urge you, if you've never been to the Kimbell, to take a stop at DFW when you're going across country sometime, and spend a day with us, and indeed with all the museums in Fort Worth, because we're one of three major museums here in town, with the Amon Carter Museum of American Art up the hill from us in a building designed by Philip Johnson, and across the street from us, the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth in a magnificent building designed by Tadeo Ando. So it's a great site for architecture and for art in the middle of the country.
I can't go to one without going to all three, and it's seriously a very easy, seductive trip to visit all three in a day. I think your response there, the thing that was most shocking to me is the fact that your collection is so small. And I don't know if, for the person that doesn't have a lot of knowledge of the museum world, 350 works may sound massive, but larger museums will have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of items that they have to manage. And one of the topics that we keep kind of coming back to on the podcast is the issue in this space these days about deaccessioning. I know that Rick Brown, and I believe you made some reference to it, how there was some deaccessioning in the beginning to focus the collection on fine examples of art. I guess one of my question is, do you turn away opportunities to receive works of art from donors at this point? Is that a reasonable question? How do you keep the collection so small? Because it seems like people would want to add to the collection.
Right. I just wish somebody would offer me a Benvenuto Cellini bronze right now. It would be most welcome, or John Bologna, let's say, or another marble by Canova. We do get offered extraordinary gifts from time to time, and the most important recently is a spectacular limestone head by Amedeo Modigliani, the Italian artists of the first couple of decades of the 20th century, who was resident in Paris, who made his career really in Paris, but who was born in Italy. And this is a work that came to us from the collection of Lucille and Ted Weiner, who had lived in Fort Worth and who collected their sculptures the collection they formed of sculptures while they were living in Fort Worth. They moved to California. Their daughter decided that she wanted this particular sculpture, which is really the most important work in the Weiner collection. She wanted it to come back to Fort Worth, and so it is on view here at the Kimbell, and it's just a great masterpiece. If you go to our website or type Kimbell Modigliani, you'll if you can spell Modigliani, and so you'll be able to see it. It's the vast majority of the collection, however, was acquired through purchase, and therefore directed really by the curatorial vision of the institution from the 1970s to the present. And in the process of building the collection, there has also been, even in the last 20 or 30 years, there has been a certain amount of grading up, if you will, building up, so that 30 years ago, the museum bought a magnificent Matisse, and we sold a Matisse as part of to pay ourselves back, if you will, because typically we own one or maybe at most two works by any one artist. I'd love it if we had two Caravaggios. We only have one, but that's, of course, more than most people do. We've got two Monets. We have, actually we have three Corrots or three Bassanos, but rare is the artist that we own more than one work by. And I speak of artists whose names we now know, as opposed to the many artists from earlier times or more remote places to our own history than the Europe that we seem to think of as being more familiar. Certainly the nameless artist who made a great sculpture in Guatemala in the 6th century, a Maya censer stand, who has a clear personality and a clear identity as an individual. Unfortunately, we don't know that person's name, and we'll never find it out because the works aren't signed or marked in any way for us to retrieve that information. But we tend to own sort of singular works, and so we can, in fact, use works already in the collection. If we're making an acquisition that's really quite expensive, we can use a work that's in our collection in a way as partial payment, if you will, on the greater acquisition. And that, of course, it comes with risks, because these judgments are subjective, and there are one or two works that used to belong in the Kimbell that no longer do, that I really wish still did. But those are few and far between, I must say. I think my predecessors, both Rick Brown at the very beginning, and then Ted Pillsbury, who did a lot of refining of the collection as he was being able to acquire in the 1980s and early 90s in particular. He was able to acquire remarkable works of art that simply aren't on the market anymore today, at least not within reach. So those kinds of strategic deaccessionings, I think, were intelligent and well done. I mean, what's the most controversial nowadays, of course, is that the notion that you should sell the work of art to use the proceeds for something other than another work of art. And I won't get into to the morals of that. It's been debated endlessly, but but basically the way that we have always been able to operate is that the nothing gets sold but that the money turns back into the collection and into having other works of art in the collection. We're enormously fortunate that Mr. Kimbell was so generous to us at the beginning, and our endowment is rich for a collection of our size and for operation of our scale.
George, I really, really appreciate your time today. This has been a real pleasure to talk about Turner and to talk about your institution. And thank you so much for gracing us with your presence in the first couple of hours back in the office after your break.
It's good to be back.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Now, the news. As we approach the end of 2021, we're able to reflect on some final numbers and to follow up on some stories from earlier in the year. First up, a look at the burgeoning NFT marketplace. As we've reported and discussed on the podcast this year, the market for NFTs has exploded in a way no one could have ever anticipated. By March of this year, NFTs were red hot, followed by a summer cooling off period and a steady rise through the fall. The NFT market tipped the scales at $100 million in 2020, while the market saw $4 billion in revenue in the first half of 2021 and $18 billion in the second half of the year. That represents a growth of 220x over 2020. The traditional art world weighs in at around $60 billion, so that $22 billion is an enormous number that begs to be taken seriously. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that not every NFT is tied to art. There are many NFTs that are tied to collectibles and in-app purchases of games, but there is no doubt that 2021 was the year of the NFT. Earlier in the year, I previewed the estate auction of Texas oil tycoon Edwin L. Cox's art collection. The sale took place with great fanfare in mid-November at Christie's. The collection of mostly Impressionist and Post-Impressionist pieces was expected to fetch roughly $179 million in pre-auction estimates, but the sale actually generated $332 million in the end. At the heart of the sale were a number of Van Goghs. One 1889 painting of olive trees titled Wooden Huts Among Olive Trees and Cypress Trees was estimated to go for $40 million, but after spirited bidding, wound up selling in the end for $71 billion. The same bidder won another lot on paper from 1888, which depicted a scene of yellow haystacks in Arles. The interesting thing about this work isn't the final hammer price of $35 million, but that the sum will be divided 3 ways as a part of a restitution agreement. It seems that the artwork, titled Mulet de Blé, was sold under duress by one German Jewish owner and looted from another leading up to World War II. The proceeds from that work were split between the heirs of Max Mirowski, Alexandre de Rothschild, and representatives of Cox's estate. Another Van Gogh work that caused a stir was a painting titled Jeune homme au bleuet that was painted in the weeks preceding Van Gogh's death. The painting depicts a red-headed young man with the stem of a blue flower in his mouth. The painting realized a hammer price nearly 10 times the pre-auction estimate, which begs the question, how can the experts be 1,000% off on their estimate? Well, my guess is that the answer lies in the speculation around the murky details of Van Gogh's last days and the shooting that resulted in his death. In the 2011 biography, Van Gogh, The Life, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Stephen Nyfa examined circumstances around the narrative that Van Gogh's deadly gunshot wound was not necessarily self-inflicted. Stories emerged of young men in town who would harass Vincent, one of which liked to dress as a cowboy and carry a pistol, while it's known that Van Gogh didn't even own a gun. A review of the autopsy indicated that to self-inflict a wound in that part of the abdomen would have been very awkward, and at such close range would have left burning, tattooing, and gunpowder residue that just wasn't present. This led a forensic pathologist to judge that Vincent didn't shoot himself, but was shot by someone else. In 2017, the epic biopic Loving Vincent pieced together Van Gogh's last days while using Van Gogh's paintings as source material for animations that tell the story. 125 artists hand-painted more than 65,000 oil paintings to bring the vision to life. If you have never seen the movie, please do. It's an amazing work of art. And in Loving Vincent, the red-headed boy from J.M.W is at the center of the tragedy. So, is this a portrait of Van Gogh's murderer? Just the prospect makes all the difference. Pre-auction estimate based on its artistic merit? $5 million. The hammer price based on this possible suspect? $46.7 million. The price of a good story. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. If you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read a transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.